I grew up in a quiet, unremarkable town, the kind of place where the summers were long and the winters were unforgiving. Our house stood on Birchwood Lane, a modest two-story with faded blue siding and a wraparound porch that always needed fixing. My parents, Margaret and Thomas, took great pride in the home, though they rarely did much to maintain it. From the outside, we looked like a typical middle-class family. My father worked as an accountant, spending long hours at a desk piled with spreadsheets and tax forms, while my mother ran a small bakery that had its busiest hours just before sunrise. Neither of them was particularly warm or affectionate, but they provided, and that was enough. I was their only child, which should have meant I was doted on, but that was never the case. My father was a man of few words, his presence in the house often marked only by the soft rustle of newspaper pages or the clink of ice in his evening whiskey. My mother was different, her energy a constant hum of movement, baking, cleaning, organizing, but not for my sake. She thrived in the presence of guests, ensuring they saw our home as warm and welcoming, even if behind closed doors, we lived more like strangers. Despite this, my childhood wasn't unhappy. It was just unremarkable. I spent hours reading in my room, disappearing into stories where the heroes were always loved, always chosen. I learned early on that my achievements, good grades, piano recitals, even the small things like helping in the kitchen, were met with indifference. Praise was reserved for appearances, how tidy the house looked when company arrived, how well my father's suit fit at office parties, how beautifully my mother's cakes were decorated. The house on Birchwood Lane had a rhythm, a structure that never wavered. Mornings smelled of coffee and cinnamon, the remnants of my mother's baking lingering in the air. Evenings were quiet, my father lost in his work, my mother fussing over bills and schedules. And through it all, I moved like a ghost, always present but never really seen. I didn't question it then. I didn't know that families could be different. That love could be given freely, without expectation. But I would learn. And one day, I would make them see me. Our house on Birchwood Lane was more than just a home. It was a carefully maintained illusion. My mother, Margaret, had a knack for crafting perfection, at least where others could see. She believed in appearances above all else, and nothing, not even reality, was allowed to tarnish the image she so carefully curated. Dinner parties were a frequent occurrence. Not extravagant, but just enough to keep up with the social expectations of our small town. The dining table, an antique oak piece my mother adored, was always set meticulously, with polished silverware and cloth napkins folded into perfect triangles. Guests would arrive, greeted by the smell of fresh bread and whatever elaborate meal my mother had spent the afternoon preparing. I used to love those nights when I was younger. The laughter, the stories, the way my mother's voice took on a lightness it never carried when it was just the three of us. My father, Thomas, would sit at the head of the table, drink in hand, nodding in the right places, though his mind was always elsewhere. He had an uncanny ability to appear engaged while contributing almost nothing at all. "Your daughter is growing up so well, Margaret," one of the guests would say, turning to me with a polite smile. "Oh, yes," my mother would reply, already moving on. "She helps out when she can, of course." I'd sit there, my presence acknowledged in the same way one might acknowledge the nice wallpaper. Never unpleasant, but never of particular interest. After the guests left, the house would return to its natural state of silence. My mother would wipe down the counters, sighing about how exhausting it was to host. My father would disappear into his study, shutting the door behind him. And I would go to bed, the lingering scent of wine and perfume clinging to the air. Despite everything, I told myself I had a good life. There were no fights, no screaming matches, no cruel words spoken outright. My parents provided for me, and that was more than many had. I had a home, food on the table, clothes that were always clean and presentable. But love, the kind I read about in books, the kind that was warm and unconditional, was absent. I didn't know what it felt like to be someone's priority, to be truly wanted. And for a long time, I convinced myself that it didn't matter. As I grew older, the gaps in our family became more apparent, not in words or arguments, but in the subtle, telling moments that lingered just a second too long. The way my mother's expression tightened when I asked for something. The absent-minded nods my father gave whenever I spoke, his attention already elsewhere. The way they treated me less like a daughter and more like an obligation, something to be managed rather than cherished. At school, I watched my classmates interact with their families. I saw mothers who hugged their children without reason, fathers who showed up to recitals and games, siblings who bickered but always seemed to return to laughter. I didn't envy them, not exactly. But I couldn't help but notice the difference. At home, affection was transactional. If I did well in school, my mother would acknowledge it with a clipped, "That's nice." If I helped with the housework before one of her dinner parties, she might offer a rare smile. But there was no warmth, no depth. It was as if she was playing a role, ensuring everything functioned the way it was supposed to, including me. My father was even more distant. He had perfected the art of being physically present, but emotionally absent. He never raised his voice, never argued, never even scolded. But he also never asked about my life, never seemed interested in who I was outside of the version of me that existed within the walls of our home. Birthdays were the same every year, mechanical and impersonal. A store-bought cake, a dinner where conversation never veered beyond the surface, a single gift that felt more obligatory than thoughtful. "Happy birthday," my mother would say, placing the wrapped package in front of me. "You're getting older." And then the moment would pass, like an appointment checked off a list. It wasn't cruelty, not in the way some might think. It was something else, something quieter, but just as cutting. Indifference. But I kept moving forward, kept playing my part in the life they had set for me. I did well in school, I followed the rules, I never gave them a reason to be disappointed. Because deep down, despite everything, I still wanted their approval. I didn't realize it then, but I was already learning one of the most important lessons of my life. Sometimes, the people who are supposed to love you the most are the ones who see you the least. The day I moved out of my parents' house, there were no tearful goodbyes, no sentimental words exchanged. My mother helped me pack in the most efficient way possible, ensuring I took only what was necessary and nothing more. My father barely looked up from his laptop as I carried the last box to my car. "That's everything, then," my mother said, brushing imaginary dust from her hands. "I guess so," I replied, lingering in the doorway, half expecting her to say something meaningful, something that might make me feel like my absence would be noticed. But she only gave a curt nod. "You should call sometimes. Let us know if you need anything." And that was it. No hug, no well wishes, just an offhand suggestion that felt more like an obligation than genuine concern. I drove away without looking back. For the first time in my life, I was free. At first, it was exhilarating. My tiny apartment, a one-bedroom with peeling wallpaper and outdated fixtures, felt like a palace simply because it was mine. Every decision, what to eat, what to buy, what to do with my time, was my own. There was no one to dictate my schedule, no quiet disapproval lurking around the corners of every room. Of course, freedom came at a cost. I worked long hours at my first real job, an entry-level position in finance that paid just enough to cover rent and groceries. I budgeted carefully, tracking every dollar, stretching meals, and saving whenever I could. There was no safety net, no fallback plan if things went wrong. But that was okay. I had built my own life, and I was determined to keep it. Then came the inevitable phone call. "We could use a little help," my mother said, her voice carefully neutral, as if asking for my money wasn't a big deal. "Your father's hours have been cut, and things are tighter than expected." I hesitated, gripping the phone. A part of me wanted to refuse, to remind them that they had never truly supported me. But I couldn't. They were still my parents, and despite everything, I wanted to prove that I was the kind of person who took care of family, even if they never did the same for me. So, I started sending money. Small amounts at first, just enough to help with bills, to cover the unexpected expenses they claimed were piling up. They never thanked me outright, only mentioned in passing that it was useful or helpful. But I kept doing it, telling myself it was the right thing to do. I had no idea then how much I would come to regret it. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, That my parents weren't treating me any differently just because I had started helping them financially. But the signs were there, subtle at first, creeping in like shadows stretching across a room at dusk. It was in the way my mother spoke to me, her words just a little sharper, her tone clipped with the kind of impatience she never used on anyone else. "You work in finance, don't you?" she'd say whenever a bill came in higher than expected. "You should know how to manage things better." It was in my father's indifference. Whenever I transferred money into their account, there was no thank you, no acknowledgement. Just a casual, "I saw the deposit." As if it were my duty. As if I were simply fulfilling an expectation. Then came the comparisons. "You know, Olivia's son just bought her a new washing machine," my mother mused one evening over the phone. "He's always been so thoughtful." Or, "Your cousin Alex helps his parents with their mortgage. You wouldn't believe how generous he is." I swallowed down the irritation, ignored the implication. I told myself it didn't matter. That they were my parents and this was what you did for family. But the longer it went on, the harder it became to ignore the growing resentment curling at the edges of my thoughts. The real cracks began to show when I visited. I would walk into the house, their house, the one I was helping to keep running, and they would barely look up. My mother would make some offhand comment about my appearance. "You look tired, dear. Are you eating properly?" Before launching into some minor inconvenience in her life that I should apparently fix. "We had to call a plumber last week," she sighed. "The bill was outrageous." "That's awful," I'd reply, even as I braced myself for what was coming next. "I suppose there's nothing we can do about it now," she continued, her voice light but laced with expectation. Unless I paid for it." And I always did. Each time, I told myself it would be the last. That I had done enough, that I wasn't obligated to keep bailing them out. And yet, when the next request came, when the next sigh, the next passive-aggressive remark, the next hint was dropped, I found myself opening my wallet all over again. I convinced myself I was just being overly sensitive. That this was normal. That they cared. But deep down, a small, cold voice was beginning to whisper something I didn't want to hear. They didn't see me as their daughter anymore. They saw me as their personal bank. The first time I truly felt it, that shift in our relationship from parent and child to debtor and creditor, was during a Sunday visit. I had stopped by after work, exhausted from a week of long hours and endless deadlines, but I still made the effort. That was what a good daughter did, wasn't it? Show up, be present, pretend like everything was fine. I arrived with a bag of groceries, not because they had asked, but because I knew they would find a way to make me feel guilty if I didn't. As soon as I walked through the door, my mother barely looked up from her tablet. "Oh, you're here," she said, tapping away at whatever article had caught her interest. "Good, I was just about to call you." My father was in his usual spot on the couch, remote in hand, barely acknowledging my presence beyond a slight nod. I set the groceries down and took a deep breath, trying not to let their indifference weigh on me. "I thought I'd pick up a few things for you," I said, forcing a smile. "Just some basics." My mother finally glanced up, her eyes flickering over the bags. "Did you get the imported coffee? The one I like?" I blinked. "No, I just got the regular brand." She sighed, already shaking her head. "You know I can't drink that cheap stuff. It upsets my stomach." I swallowed hard, ignoring the flash of irritation bubbling under my skin. "I didn't realize. I'll grab it next time." Was all she said, already turning back to her screen. My father didn't say anything at all. The rest of the visit was the same as always, conversation that revolved around their lives, their needs, their inconveniences. At one point, my mother mentioned that their dishwasher had been acting up. "I swear, nothing in this house lasts," she said, casting a pointed look in my direction. "But, of course, getting it repaired will cost an arm and a leg." I knew what was coming before she even said it. "I suppose we'll just have to deal with it," she continued, in that same calculated tone. "Unless you could help." I should have said no. I should have reminded her that I was already sending them money, that I wasn't made of endless resources, that I had my own bills to worry about. But the guilt, that ever-present force that had been ingrained in me since childhood, squeezed around my ribs until the words fell from my lips without thinking. I'll cover it, I murmured. Her smile was fleeting, more satisfied than grateful. That's very helpful of you, dear. I left that evening with a sour taste in my mouth, the weight of another unnecessary expense dragging at my shoulders. And yet, the worst part wasn't even the money, it was the realization that they didn't see it as a favor. They saw it as expected. It was a pattern now. They had no hesitation in coming to me when they needed something, when they wanted a bill paid, when an appliance broke, when they simply didn't feel like spending their own money. And if I hesitated, if I even thought about refusing, my mother would let out that disappointed sigh, my father would barely lift his gaze from the television, and I would be reminded, once again, of my place. At work, I was respected. I had built a career, earned my promotions, proved myself capable. My coworkers came to me for advice, my boss valued my input, my efforts were rewarded. But at home, none of that mattered. I could have made $1 million, or I could have made 10. To them, I was only as valuable as what I could give. And the worst part? They never once asked how I was doing. Not once. Not about my job, my personal life, my well-being. Only about the next deposit, the next favor, the next thing they could take. And with every transaction, the resentment grew. I should have stopped. I should have put my foot down the moment I realized what was happening. But guilt has a way of digging its claws into you, twisting itself into something that feels like obligation, like love. And so, I kept giving. It wasn't just the money. It was the time, the effort, the constant feeling that I owed them something, even though I couldn't explain why. Every visit turned into a list of complaints. Every phone call ended with a new problem for me to solve. My mother had developed a talent for making it seem like I was the one who had fallen short, that I was the reason they were struggling. If you made just a little more, she said one evening, stirring her tea as though she wasn't slowly cutting me apart with her words, you wouldn't even notice the money you send us. My father, as always, said nothing. Just a small grunt of agreement, as if her words were fact, as if I should be doing more. More. It was never enough. I started noticing the way my mother spoke about me to others, never cruel, never outright malicious, but always laced with something that made my stomach turn. Oh, yes, she's doing well, she would say to a friend over the phone, her voice loud enough that I could hear from the next room. Of course, she has no real responsibilities, so it's easy for her to focus on work. No real responsibilities. As if my job, my apartment, my entire life outside of them didn't count. As if my only real duty was to them. Then, at a family gathering, my aunt asked how work was going. Before I could answer, my mother waved a dismissive hand. Oh, she's always working. It's a wonder she hasn't driven herself into the ground. Then, with a small, knowing smile, she added, but at least we benefit from it, right? Laughter. A joke at my expense. I forced a tight smile, pretending like it didn't dig into my ribs like a knife. That night, after everyone had left, I confronted her. Why do you talk about me like that? I asked, voice tight with frustration. She barely looked up from her phone. Oh, don't be so sensitive. You know we appreciate everything you do for us. Appreciate. The word felt hollow. Appreciation was gratitude. Appreciation was recognition. What I got from them wasn't appreciation. It was expectation. But still, I said nothing. Even when my bank account was noticeably lighter. Even when I found myself saying no to things I wanted so I could keep up with their demands. Even when I realized they hadn't once, not once, asked if I was okay. The resentment festered, silent but growing, a storm gathering on the horizon. And then, one evening, everything changed. It happened by accident. If I had left just 5 minutes earlier, if I hadn't gone back inside to grab my scarf, I never would have heard it. I had stopped by my parents' house to drop off another, small, financial favor, this time, covering their property tax shortfall. As usual, there was no real gratitude, just my mother's offhand comment about how these things creep up on you, and my father's distracted nod as he accepted the money without so much as a thank you. I had smiled, pretended it didn't bother me, and made my way to the door. But just as I stepped outside, I realized I had left my scarf draped over the back of the living room chair. I turned back, moving as quietly as I always did in that house, slipping through the entryway just as my mother spoke. "I don't know what we'd do if we hadn't had her," she said with a sigh. "At least she's good for something." I froze. My father let out a low hum of agreement. It's ironic, isn't it? We never even wanted kids. The air left my lungs in an instant, my entire body going still. "She was a mistake," my mother continued, her voice casual, as if she were discussing the weather. "But I suppose it worked out in the end. She's certainly more useful than we expected. All that money she makes, it would be foolish not to take advantage of it." A mistake. Useful. I stood there, unseen, unheard, my fingers curled into fists at my sides. The room spun around me, the edges of their words sinking in like jagged glass. My entire life, I had convinced myself that maybe, just maybe, they loved me in their own way. That their indifference, their dismissiveness, their constant expectations weren't intentional. That they just didn't know how to show love. But they did. They just didn't feel it for me. To them, I wasn't a daughter. I was a walking bank account, a tool they could use, an inconvenience that had, by sheer luck, turned into an asset. And I had let them. Something inside me cracked, the weight of years of being overlooked, dismissed, used finally settling in my chest like a cold, immovable stone. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love. But they had never even wanted me in the first place. I turned and walked out the door, scarf forgotten, rage burning through the numbness settling over me. I wasn't going to be their tool anymore. They were about to learn exactly what it meant to underestimate me. I drove home in silence, my fingers clenched so tightly around the steering wheel that my knuckles ached. My parents' voices echoed in my head, their casual cruelty replaying over and over. She was a mistake. At least she's good for something. Every sacrifice I had made for them, every time I had put their needs above my own, every moment I had convinced myself they loved me in their own way, it all shattered. The illusion was gone. By the time I reached my apartment, my mind was clear. I knew what I had to do. The first step was simple: cut them off. I pulled out my phone and opened my banking app. My monthly transfers to them were set up automatically, a habit I had never questioned before. With a single tap, I canceled every scheduled payment. The weight of obligation lifted off my shoulders in an instant. Next, I went through my transaction history, tallying up every dollar I had ever given them. Rent assistance, utility bills, medical expenses that never seemed urgent, emergency, money that always ended up funding unnecessary luxuries. It was thousands. More than I wanted to admit. And then I went after it. They had given me access to their banking information years ago, back when they convinced me to help them manage their finances. My mother, ever lazy when it came to numbers, had let me set up their online banking for her. The password she used was the same for everything: her email, her social media, even the security question answers she had rattled off without a second thought. I logged in. It was almost too easy. I transferred every cent I had ever given them back into my own account. The money was legally mine. I had the receipts, the bank statements, even the text messages where they had asked for it. If they tried to fight it, I had proof. By the time I was done, their account was nearly empty. I sat back in my chair, staring at the confirmation screen, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. For once, they would be the ones left scrambling. They would have to figure things out without me. But I wasn't finished yet. I went through my phone, blocking both of their numbers. Then, I pulled up my family group chat, the same one where my mother would send passive-aggressive messages about how lucky I was to be able to help them. I typed out a single message. "I know everything. You'll never see another cent from me again. Don't contact me. You're dead to me now, just like I was to you." Then, I left the group and deleted their contacts. The moment the message sent, a strange calm settled over me. The anger hadn't disappeared, not entirely, but it was no longer suffocating. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love, and I was done. They would feel what it was like to lose me. To lose their personal bank. To lose the one person who had kept their lives running smoothly. And for the first time, I felt something close to peace. The silence didn't last long. Less than 24 hours after I cut them off, my phone lit up with calls from unknown numbers, my mother, my father, even distant relatives I hadn't spoken to in years. I ignored them all. Then came the emails, the messages through social media, the increasingly frantic attempts to reach me. At first, they were confused. There must be some misunderstanding. You can't actually mean this. Then, they were angry. How dare you take our money? After everything we've done for you? And finally, when they realized I wasn't coming back, the guilt trips began. You're tearing this family apart. We raised you, we gave you everything, and this is how you repay us? I didn't reply. For every message I received, I remembered another moment when they had dismissed me, belittled me, taken from me without a second thought. Every favor I had done for them, every sacrifice I had made, every time they had laughed at my expense or treated me like nothing more than a resource to be exploited. I owed them nothing. Then came the real fallout. A week later, I got a message from my cousin Rachel. Hey, your parents are in a bad place. They're telling everyone you ruined them, that you stole from them and left them broke. Just thought you should know. I laughed when I read it. Stole from them? The irony was almost too much. I sent Rachel a single reply. I just took back what was mine. Then, out of curiosity, I checked my parents' social media accounts. Sure enough, my mother had posted a long, dramatic rant about betrayal and selfish children who abandon their families. The comments were filled with sympathy from her friends, people who only knew the version of the story she had carefully crafted. I could have corrected them. I could have exposed every ugly truth, every lie, every act of manipulation. But I didn't, because it didn't matter. Their downfall wasn't my problem anymore. Without my financial support, they had to face the reality they had ignored for years. Bills they couldn't afford. Debts they had assumed I would cover forever. They had spent so long relying on me that they had no backup plan when I was gone. And I knew, deep down, that they had never expected me to leave. I had been their safety net, their insurance policy, their golden goose. And now? Now they were falling, and there was no one left to catch them. I blocked them everywhere. Deleted their numbers. And for the first time in my life, I felt free. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. And my parents? They disappeared from my life like a storm that had finally passed. At first, there were more attempts to pull me back. Calls from relatives trying to convince me to fix things. Messages from my mother, shifting between fury and pleading, sometimes in the same breath. My father, ever silent, had only sent one email. You're making a mistake. I never replied. Because I wasn't making a mistake. The mistake had been thinking they would ever love me as a daughter, instead of valuing me as a resource. The mistake had been waiting for them to see me, to care, to change. The world didn't end without them. In fact, my life got better. Without those constant demands, I finally had money for myself. I went on a trip, one that I had been putting off for years because of their endless needs. I started taking care of me, buying the things I wanted, indulging in simple joys, making my home mine instead of a place I constantly worried about losing because of their financial burdens. And the most unexpected part? I felt lighter. I no longer woke up dreading a phone call. I no longer tensed when my bank account balance dropped, knowing another favor was around the corner. My days were my own, my choices belonged to me, and for the first time, I wasn't carrying the weight of people who had never once carried me. A year passed before I heard anything about them again. Rachel, one of the only family members I still spoke to, sent me a text one evening. Your parents had to sell the house. They moved into a small apartment across town. It's not great. I stared at the message for a long moment, waiting to feel something. Pity, regret, sadness. But there was nothing. Because I had given them a good life. I had supported them, sacrificed for them, bled for them. And they had laughed behind my back, treated me like a tool, and assumed I would always be there. They made their choices. And now, for the first time, they were feeling the consequences. I didn't reply to Rachel's message. I simply turned off my phone, curled up in my beautifully furnished apartment, the one I had paid for myself, and listened to the quiet. Not the kind of quiet that comes from loneliness. the kind of quiet that comes from peace. And I had never known peace like this before.